Welcome to Spotlight on the Real Science of Sport podcast with Professor Ross Tucker and Gareth Davies.
Yes, indeed, folks. Welcome to the Spotlight. This is the weekly Science of Sport show that is inspired and informed by what is being discussed over on our Discourse community. That's our VIP lounge, if you will. You gain access to that lounge by making a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com. There'll be a link, as always, in the show notes. And so if you enjoy what we do and you want to just support that, that's what you click on. You choose a tier. All the tiers get you equal access to the lounge. And when you go there, you will find a host of listeners who are discussing everything sports science related, from the news stories we're about to discuss as part of this show, all the way to sports science of training, nutrition, even the odd lawsuit, which is something Gareth posted in the last week in his weekly Caught My Eye newsletter, which is another perk of being a member. It's pretty much our only source of revenue other than those ads that Acast stick in at the inopportune moments. So if you do enjoy what we do and want to support that, that's where you can go and show your support. I am joined, as always, on the Spotlight by the aforementioned Gareth Davies, the Caught My Eye author and moderator over on Discourse, who keeps a keen eye on the news and makes sure that I never miss anything, which is great. And this week we've had a period of the last 4 to 6 weeks where it's been pretty event and news heavy, and there's a lot of news to get through again. But this week we try to make it a little bit more around the more substantive topics that are being discussed over on Discourse. But we do kick off, as usual, with our Discourse Digest, where we whip around the world and offer some sports science insights on the news stories. And we begin this week with a story on human trafficking. No jokes.
Well,
not really.
Sort of human trafficking. They called it athlete trafficking. Chris Chavez, he brought this story to our attention following an article in the Washington Post. And I'll use air quotes. It's about athlete trafficking. The NCAA, America's college system, is recruiting really hard in Africa at the moment, especially East Africa and Kenya. And they're organising time trials to identify Kenya's top athletic talent at younger ages, then to bring them over to the States to represent the colleges in the US. And as I say, athlete trafficking sounds a bit harsh to me, because isn't it just supplying these athletes with what they want, which is a route out of poverty and perhaps fame and fortune? So is it trafficking, or is it an opportunity?
It's just globalization. Yeah, the athlete trafficking was not our word, right? That was what the article mentioned it as, and it's the criticism that they've received. And I suppose the interesting insight here is that criticism justified? Because on the surface, everyone's benefiting, right? The university that recruits these athletes is benefiting because they're getting better athletes. The competition level in the system they're competing in is going up, and obviously the athlete is benefiting. So what's the problem, right? But I suppose, and the article makes it clear, there are concerns around the age at which some of these athletes are coming in, like late 20s into college systems, the extent to which it degrades or diminishes the local development of talent in the regions where these athletes are going into, because we've said before often that sport is a zero-sum game. There are only X number of places on a track or a cross-country team, so if that place is taken by an imported athlete, it means that a local athlete can no longer have it. Does that damage the local system? So those are some of the interesting dilemmas. I mean, I remember thinking South Africa's best strategy to win Olympic medals in swimming and track and field might be emigration. In other words, get our, especially swimmers, to the US system and see if they can, if you put 50 a year in there and 2 per year become world class every Olympic cycle, you'd have 8 world class swimmers. The problem is that the efficiency might not even be that high. So there are some concerns on both ends, actually, if it's a strategy that you're using, like I was sort of semi-jokingly saying. I don't know what your thoughts are around it. I mean, it's some of the criticism also that in response to the article was not rational, saying like, oh, you can't bring all these doped Kenyans into the US. They're not doped athletes before they're discovered. They're just good athletes, because the way they did it, they describe in detail in that article. They run these time trials and they basically just pick the best performers. It's like an entrance exam, except you run it.
Yeah, it's like a 3,000 meter race. It's called the Golden Ticket by the organisers, and it is organised by the college systems. John Murray, say, for example, head coach at Texas Tech, he helps fund time trials. He says, if I'm going to compete against these really top teams in my conference, I've got to go find other countries and other places to find athletes. You mentioned doping. Now, I don't think that the criticism was about bringing all these doped athletes over per se. It's whether or not it encourages the Kenyan youth to dope in order to get this golden ticket.
Yeah,
And
maybe, but that assumes that doping is really widespread.
well, it is in Kenya. We talked last week about the guy who bought
Yeah, but
what was
he's
it?
already an elite
EPO
athlete.
off a bus conductor.
Yeah, but I don't think it's like I don't think school kids are gonna go and find when if you're not an athlete already. I don't know. To me, it's
Well,
a bit too
uh,
far.
I'll give you another example. And in the past 2 years, it says in this article, two Kenyans competed in the NCAA, one in Tulane and one at Texas Christian University. They were provisionally suspended when it was revealed that they'd evaded or missed drug tests prior to arriving in the US.
Yeah.
So it is going on. And some of the routes that they're taking to avoid immigration issues, like moving the athletes into European countries first and then applying for visas from there, it all sounds a little bit dodgy, a little bit underhand in that sense.
Yeah, I mean
But
that's clearly dodgy. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so although it seems reasonable to me, because I was thinking of it in comparison to, say, New Zealand rugby, who've been known to cherry pick talent from the South Sea Islands, haven't they, for their rugby teams? And Major League Baseball in the US. And every Major League Baseball team, I had a look at this, has got an academy set up in the Dominican Republic to bring players on from very, very young ages. And it's nothing different to that. It just sounds, if you use the term athlete trafficking, it's bound to turn heads. But I think it's just giving people opportunities.
There's a couple of French professional clubs that have got academy relationships with South African high schools in rugby, and I know also that they go to Fiji and they find players from there as well and recruit them into their system. So it does happen across sports. I'm sure the tennis is not that different as well. American colleges would go to Europe and try and find some of their tennis players. And then see, they're trading with quite a strong hand because they've got the college system. There's an education at the end of this for you. So the incentives to go are enormous for the young athletes. And if you're a Kenyan athlete, then clearly. So that is an interesting one. Like, will it facilitate and incentivize more doping than is already the case? But then someone should do a sting operation. This opportunity's ripe for it. Set it up as a golden ticket and see how many people you can catch, and then try and get to the source of the drugs, because that's always the mystery to me, is where are these athletes getting these drugs? Bus conductor walks into a shop, comes out with EPO. Come on, there's got to be more to it than that.
You'd have thought so, yeah. But I mean, the other thing you touched on was that it is going to sort of, well, not destroy, but damage the American running scene, especially through the middle distances, which is where these runners are going to be taking part. So, I mean, that is a concern for the Americans.
Yeah, it is. We've seen other policies to try and stop that, right? In the cricket's IPL, which we both love, sarcastic font. They've said like limits on foreign players because they want to expose and it's helped their domestic cricket enormously. So you can actually spin it around the other way, but it seems not to be the case in the US system, and it's a difficult one because I mean, Chris, in the tweet that we shared, posted something along the lines of like 5 out of the top 10 in a race, women's race, 7 out of the top 10 in a men's race, were all athletes who are coming in from that. So you could look at this from two directions. You could say the standard is elevated, and if that's the standard, right? There's nowhere to hide in running. So if you're a college-age athlete and you're getting beaten by 35 seconds in a 5K, well, stop or get better. So they're getting an earlier exposure to world-class standards as a consequence of those athletes. So that's, you could say, hey, this is a good thing. But I do think probably the net effect is probably to dry up the local pathway.
Yeah, I think that's what Chavez's issue would be, is that because he actually says not faulting Kenyan athletes who are chasing life-changing opportunities. So I think it's more that the Americans are concerned about their talent pathways drying up.
Yeah,
they win enough medals anyway. So
the NCAA will have to say, we're going to allow 3 on a cross-country team, or 8 scoring athletes at an event can be non-American born, or some sort of quota system in that direction. That's the only way they can really address that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting one though.
It is. We'll move on to some rapid fire news. So this week it was reported that Caster Semenya, she had dropped her legal case because she'd won, hadn't she, her appeal in July, I think it was, with Kaz.
At the European Human Rights Court. It wasn't a CAS decision they were overturning, but it was, the ECHR. Yeah.
But her legal team announced that this week they will seek no further appeals in a legal battle against World Athletics. And then I noticed literally half an hour before we came to record this that Caster herself says that it's not necessarily over. She's still yet to decide if we still go on with the courts. I'm still waiting for my legal team to finalise everything. She's saying that the legal team was misquoted.
Yeah, do you have the quote by her lawyer, Patrick Brasher is his name, talking about Semenya's challenge would not be taken further in the circumstances? Because in this latest article today from a German media outlet, Semenya basically says he's been misquoted. Brasher's been misquoted. It's not about stopping, it's never the end, Semenya said. They didn't understand what my legal team was saying. But when you read Brasher's quote, it's hard to actually misinterpret what he said. It's pretty direct.
Yeah. He actually wrote an email to the Associated Press. It's not like he just got caught on the cuff. He said, Caster's legal challenge reached the highest possible court with a highly successful outcome and will not be taken further in the circumstances.
Yeah, and then went on to discuss how the reason to not take it further, and this was going to be the insight on this podcast, was that the policy had changed compared to when Semenya was in CAS in the first place in 2019. Because, and this is, one day there'll be a book written about the evolution of the DSD policy, but it was in that court case that World Athletics finally committed to the watertight position, in my opinion. Because even at the start of that court case, the language around the DSD policy was women or females with hyperandrogenism. So it was female high testosterone. And it was actually during the creation and the production of all the arguments ahead of CAS in 2019, February 2019, that World Athletics changed that. And suddenly the policy and the language went to males with biological advantage with DSDs. And they flipped it in a way that I think really strengthened their position. And they obviously took away that really paradoxical, confusing issue around only regulating certain events. They've subsequently taken the testosterone reduction requirement out. It's no longer permissible for anyone with male advantage, even lowering testosterone. So on 3 or 4 different levels, the policy as of the 9th of October 2025 is no longer anything like the policy from 2019 that Semenya first lost the case on. And so when I saw Brasher's comments, I thought, well, yes, this is it. They finally recognized that this is not a winnable case because it's about male advantage. And now Semenya said that that's not that's not the case. So our insights are, well, they're not untrue. It's just they seem to be running up in the opposite direction to what Semenya's talking about. But I mean,
I don't have his exact quote on it. It just says, it noted in his email to the Associated Press that the current regulations are very different to those Semenya challenged in court when her case started 7 years ago. But her recent victory, excuse me, at the European Rights Court might provide a basis for a new challenge by another athlete against the current regulations. Almost as if she's laid the foundations and now she's going to put her case to rest and not fight anymore.
Yeah, that's how it came across. That's how everyone interpreted it. But it's interesting, like you look at some of the quotes today, Semenya saying, when you're born with your differences, those are your differences and they don't make you a great athlete. You are a great athlete through training, hard work, showing up every day, dedication, not because of your given body. Well, yeah, that's all good and well, as long as you're in the right category. Because the reality is that when 2 humans both show up and do hard work and show up every day with dedication to training, the male beats the female. And so that's why we have a category. So Semenya is playing this game still of I'm just different from other women. No, Semenya is male. And I mean, when you were reading now, and we use the she pronoun, but like, let's not leave any room for doubt here. Caster Semenya is biologically male, with full male advantage, but then talks about regulations like this are not safe for sport. These are also quotes from this latest article. It questions the quality of leaders we have now. That's weak leadership because you can't impose rules that you know are not in favor of some of the nationalities where in their country those are illegal. What's illegal? World Athletics is a body that can regulate eligibility for its own competitions. If you're going to regulate, you have to regulate fairly for everyone, says Semenya. Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
So it's just gibberish.
It does. It seems to be a little bit confused now. I mean, I get confused by all the court cases going back and forth and the legal battles. But I thought this was pretty much nailed down now. And it's not as if is he suggesting that World Athletics are acting illegally?
Yeah, I think so. Like that's because I think Semenya's probably been given advice that it's unconstitutional. The Human Rights Court obviously wouldn't dissuade her from that perspective or opinion because they ruled in Semenya's favor. It's just someone saying they're not allowed to do this, but of course they're allowed to do this. In fact, our opinion is they have to do it because if you're going to protect the category, you have to have a way to enforce that protection.
In reading around this, it appears that a lot of people are thinking that Khalif, the boxer from the Olympics, would be the one to take up the challenge now, to work on, to stand on the work that Caster's done. And I'm wondering if he or she has decided, no, I'm not going to. And now Caster's like, oh, well, I better take it back up again.
Maybe. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a consortium of these DSD male athletes, because there are a few others, obviously. Khalif is one. There's the other boxer from Paris. Semenya, no longer active, but has become the sort of spokesperson for the cause. There are a few other track and field athletes we know about. Wouldn't surprise me to see a block case come up around this. The Khalif one's interesting, and it was discussed over on Discourse because they're talking there about the case against World Boxing will be around the screening, the SRY genetic screen that is being done. Or is the case going to be against the exclusion of males? Because those are two different arguments that would have to be made, and I don't know which one is actually going to go to CAS. You'd have to bundle them together, because even if they got the screen set aside, the sport would still exclude them.
I've just been reading actually this article, which literally we only came across just before we started recording. Semenya has revealed she's been in contact with Khalif. We had a conversation. I said to her, look, you have to understand in this world, when something is special, when something is beautiful, people will always criticize. As a woman who has faced a similar situation, you have to be brave, fight for justice, and make sure you love yourself for who you are. So it's all a bit hyperbolic now, isn't it?
And emotive. And that's is the fundamental characteristic of the debate, is that one side is emotive and appeals to those kinds of claims, and the other side is saying, but hang on a moment, let's talk biology. And they don't talk directly to one another. They pass one another by. And that's the card because that's the only card they've got. So anyway, right. It's bound to drag on and on and on. I think an interesting development will be when the IOC commits to whatever its next policy is going to be, because Coventry took on that role of the new leader of the IOC with the promise to do something around this, and that will happen, I would imagine, in the next few months. And that'll be pretty interesting to track the reaction and responses to that. But again, I wouldn't be surprised to see some consortium or block of these male athletes coming against maybe the IOC if they commit to that, or World Athletics if it's not them, whoever it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll move on to a new section because it's called Ross Surprises Gareth with some news stories he hasn't told him anything about.
Yeah, there were just a couple of things that I saw last week happened in the world of sport. One was, remember last week we were talking about kicking in rugby and how the women's game doesn't have that and the men's does. Mm-hmm. Then I was just reading on Twitter X, whatever it is, on Friday night, and Sam Lana, who covers a lot of rugby, was talking about a player for Bath, Ben Spencer, who's the Bath scrum half, and who'd made 23 kicks in the game, and we were on record watch because the most kicks ever in a Premier League match was 26 by one player. And so Ben Spencer gets to 23, he gets to 24. His 25th kick puts a player through to score a try. His 26th kick is probably a box kick or something. And then at the end of the game, on the 81st minute or so, after the sort of hoot has gone, the last action of the game is Spencer kicks the ball out into touch for the 27th kick, which is the most ever made by one player in a game in Premier Rugby. And I was just thinking about it, because ball in play is only 40 minutes. And if you assume that possession is, let's say, equally split, it means Bath had the ball for 20 minutes and Spencer kicked 27 times all by himself. So he's kicking basically every 40 seconds that Bath had the ball.
What position does he play?
Scrum half.
Scrum
So
half. I knew you
yeah.
were going to say scrum half. It's just box kick after box kick after box
Yeah,
kick.
but not all. Like the one kick was worth 7 points. And he also kicks the conversions, but they're not counted. So there's 4 conversions in that game. They beat Sale 28-16, I think was the final score. But anyway, I thought of it like with a sort of smile, because we said last week, well, not we, Steve Hansen once said, a kick is the solution to a problem. So that shows you the men's game has got a lot of problems that can be solved with kicking.
Oh no, it's not solving the problems with kicking though, is it?
Well,
Because the problem is it's becoming an unwatchable product. People don't pay to go and watch one player kick 20. Because what was the other scrum half? He probably, say, he even did half of them. That's over 40 kicks from just two players in that game.
Yeah, it's a kick a minute probably of ball in playtime.
That's not what people want to see. I know you don't. You say that okay, it shouldn't just all be about ball in play and things like that. But people don't pay just to watch kicks go back and forth.
Yeah, I would argue that
Women's
you
World
want to
Cup
see
was so good.
purposeful kicking. I mean, like we scored a try against Argentina. You'd have seen that cross kick from Sasha Feinberg Mgomazulu across to Colby. Like that's a highlight reel moment. So like by all means kick like that. But I agree. I get your point. You're right. But it just struck me that we'd literally recorded and released last week's pod, and then this record got broken, and I was tracking it on Twitter.
I was almost surprised it was so low. I thought it might have been more.
I'm sure in the international, that's just in the Premiership rugby, so I'm sure in international or some other game, someone's kicked 30-something times.
Be interesting to see as time goes on whether the women's game, the number of kicks in the game by players just increases gradually over and over.
I would predict yes, almost certainly, because defenses will get better, and again, the problems will emerge. You're better off kicking the ball away than holding it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you have another one as well?
I did.
Story.
What was it though?
Was it the one from Jonathan Galt?
Oh yes, just a last word on the Tokyo World Championships, because Jonathan Galt brought out this I thought really interesting article. He went away on a little bit of deserved holiday and then came up with this piece looking at some of the quirky stats around World Champs. So I wanted to give you this. The crazy statistic is that in the women's 100 meters, Melissa Jefferson wins by 0.17 seconds. We spoke at the time about how dominant that one was. The combined winning time, this is first to second, in the 800, 1500, 10,000, steeplechase, and marathon was 0.22 seconds.
Okay, that's a pretty impressive stat.
So it's cool. So I'll give you those stats. So the men's 800 was won by 0.04 of a second. The 15 by 0.02 of a second. The 10,000 by 0.06 of a second, and the steeplechase by Jordy Beamish 0.07 of a second. And then remember that marathon finish where Simbu beat Petros by 0.03 of a second. So that's 0.22. So the only exception in that list is the men's 5,000, which was won by 0.48. But those 5 distance events were won by just 0.05 of a second more than the single shortest women's track event was won. I thought it was a crazy stat. And I actually saw that David Epstein tweeted it, having read this piece by Jonathan Galt, which is full of other really interesting articles. Like, for instance, athletes who've only ever won silver medals, never a gold at a world championship. Kenny Bednarek joined that club at these world champs and so on. So it's a really cool piece, and it'll be in the show notes, the link. But I thought that stat in particular about how crazy close the men's distance races were was really, really interesting.
Who won that 5,000 by half a second, which is just...
Cole Hocker.
Oh, right, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So that race was won by twice the margin of all the other 5 combined.
Wow. Well, we did say it was a cracking championship. That's why I gave it 9 out of 10, you see.
Yeah. Well, you knew something. The stats have subsequently confirmed. So yeah, that was just the last word on the Tokyo Worlds. I thought it was a really cool piece. I love those quirky little stats. There's a whole bunch of them there. As I say, it'll be in the show notes.
Mm-hmm. We're sort of bouncing around the world of sport. We're going to go back to rugby, but it's about concussion and MRI scans. Because Short Paul noticed an article posted it on Discourse. That Gloucester Rugby and the Podium Institute, they're partnering on a head injury study, and to get data on head injuries, they are going to conduct MRI scans immediately after games using a mobile MRI scanner in a truck that will follow them to away games. The study aims to explore the body's physiological response to head injuries by employing a high-specification MRI scanner to image elite male rugby union players before and after head injury events. Baseline scans have been acquired for all Gloucester rugby players participating in the study during the pre-season period, and will be compared to scans in non-elite control groups in contact and non-contact sports. The MRI scans will be complemented by video footage and head acceleration data from the instrumented mouthguards players currently use to explore what happens when a player experiences a head injury. So I can't see any downsides to this. As usual, I was sort of incorrect in that. Because my idea on Discourse was that any data is good data, but that's not quite the case, is it?
Yeah, it's a really important study, and it's part of a bigger study that I know is being done. There's a few different clubs, not just Gloucester. They have to be, because you need big sample sizes to pull this kind of thing off. And as you said, they're going to link some of the data they get from the MRI to the head acceleration data from the mouthguard. I think there's also an arm of the study that's going to gather saliva so they can look at the messenger RNAs to try and track recovery after games and injuries and so on. The biggest danger here is, like, as a clinical tool, nobody really knows what that MRI scan means. So when a player comes in and says, what does it show? It's really difficult for any clinician to say, well, Gareth, it's telling me the following things. So fine, they're not going to use it for that purpose. It's research only. My experience has been that when you develop something and you introduce it for research purposes, there's still a clinical demand for it. And people find it quite difficult to separate the clinical from the research. So there's going to be a little bit of tension, I would imagine, there, because you've got a scan result and it's showing, let's call it an abnormality or an atypical pattern. I don't know enough about MRIs to even try and go into detail, so I'm not going to. But the player's doing this as part of their study, right? So they're saying, but I've had this concussion and I'd like to know now exactly what the prognosis is. Well, we can't tell you that. So there's a little bit of possibilities for frustration in that regard. But you can draw a boundary around it and say that we're not going to act on this. We're only going to use it for research purposes. But then, like one of our Discourse members, Dylan, pointed out, is that if you scanned 100 players, you're going to find a few of those, potentially many, who've got some other abnormalities in their brain scans, and then what do? There's going to be some ethical obligation that for certain MRI findings you have to act, for others you don't, because you're just gathering information. So that's the first challenge, is what do you do with the information you've got? Because you can't just sit on all of it. Some of it, yes, not all of it. Then the second part is, even for gathering data, if you don't design the study in a robust way with a large enough sample size, you're going to produce something at the end that might be quite misleading. You know the old story about the fighter planes in World War II that come back and they look where the bullet holes are, and then they design reinforcements on the wings because that's where all the bullet holes are. But no, you've studied the survivors. What you really should have seen is all the planes in the ocean that got shot down with all the bullet holes in the fuselage. You know that story, right? It's the classic, classic anecdote to illustrate survivorship bias. There's a risk of that happening here as well, because when a player plays in, let's say, an 80-minute rugby match, there probably are going to be MRI changes. That's inevitable. One of those players gets a concussion, and what you're trying to do is you're trying to find what's the MRI with a concussion compared to the MRI without, even though we've had all the same exposures to tackles and running and exercise and high-intensity load, basically. And so the extent to which MRI can produce a clean signal is the big question here. And in diagnostics, there's a challenge when you have a false positive, because let's say you scanned 100 players without a concussion, maybe one of those comes up positive anyway because it's a false test result. More likely than that, it's going to be 10, 20 of those 100 players are going to come up with a false positive. And then all of a sudden you create this over-reporting of something that's not actually there. So that can be mitigated, of course, through study design, and I'm sure that they've thought about that and are trying to test as many control players as possible to establish that. But it invites the risk of that happening. In prosecution and in law, it's called the prosecutor's fallacy, and in diagnostics, it's often called the base rate fallacy, where the moment your test throws up false positives, then those positive results start to have no meaning.
So what are they actually likely to be looking for? You said abnormalities then in the MRI. They're just going to get data.
Yeah, and
But
then what they'll be looking for is in the aftermath of that concussion, they'll be looking to see how the MRI returns to its baseline measurements, because that'll give you some measurement of the recovery from a concussion. Because one of the big challenges that the sport's got, and it's true not just for rugby union, but league and NFL, AFL, is that when there's a concussion, how soon can I play? Now, at the moment, that's managed by all those sports in something called the GRTP, General Return to Play Protocol, where it's primarily symptom regulated. So in other words, the player has to initially rest for a day. When they're symptom-free, they start very light exercise. As they move symptom-free from one phase to the next, they can do a little bit harder exercise, weightlifting, running. Eventually, they graduate to full contact, and then they can play on the seventh day. The critics of that say that it gets players back too soon, that no one should be playing for, some people say, 28 days after a concussion. The counterpoint to that is that if you forced every player to sit out for 28 days after a concussion, they would simply stop telling you their symptoms. They would just tell you they're fine, you know, and like you'd never get players acknowledging a concussion, and I think you'd drive it underground. That's a real concern. So, but regardless, there are concerns around whether the players are coming back too soon. And one of the purposes or the intentions around using scanning is to see whether there are changes in the brain that persist up to time point X, Y, or Z, and can we use those to help inform the return to play decision? So that they're looking for how is it different after a concussion compared to a game, and how does it return to, that's what they'll be asking, how does it return to baseline in order to know that this player's recovered? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, I wrote in when I asked you about this on Discourse, I said it doesn't need to be diagnostic. It helps in protecting the current players playing rugby then. But really, they're doing the research for future generations of players down the line.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a pretty ambitious study. It's a really big one, with, as I say, like 4 or 5 different arms. And I hope it produces something. Like, I mean, I shared on Discourse a few articles, one of which was the consensus around technology for the management and treatment of concussions. And at the moment, everyone is pretty much agreed that it's got great potential, but hasn't reached a clinical performance level that would allow you to act on it. Because as I say, the moment something is relatively rare, and I wish concussion was rarer, but it's still, it's not like there are 5 a match, there's 1 every 2 matches, let's say, and you have a high risk of false positives from a test, it ends up meaning that more positives are false than true. So you could test 100 players and you might say 20 false ones, but only 3 of those are actually concussions. They're positives rather, but only 3 of those are true positives, a concussion, and 17 of them are false. And if that happens, the game rejects it straight away, as they should.
On a similar line, sadly in the news this week, motor neuron disease was back in the headlines. There's Lewis Moody, the ex-England rugby player, has been diagnosed with it. And it was a talk, I think Dr. Stu brought it up on Discourse. And I asked if it was a proven link between motor neuron disease and concussion or CTE. Because of the stories we hear, it does seem to be a link, but we don't really know, do we?
No, I mean, it's emerging. The evidence for a link is emerging. So there have been a few studies that have been done, and basically these studies all function more or less the same way. They access health registries. One was in Scotland in footballers. There was another one in Scotland in rugby players. The most recent of those was from New Zealand. And then what they do, and I'll actually put that up for those of you watching it on YouTube. This is the title page. I'll read it to you. It's Neurodegenerative Diseases in Male Form of First-Class New Zealand Rugby Players. And it was just published a couple of weeks ago. Link will be in the show notes, as usual. And basically they end up going and accessing the health records of basically the entire population of New Zealand, which amounts to 2.39 million people. And of those, 12,861 of them were high-level, either provincial or higher rugby players between 1950 and 2000. And then you match them for age, ethnicity, birthplace, and then knowing their cause of death and their later in life neurodegenerative outcomes, you work out what it's called a hazard ratio, or let's call it the odds of developing conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, motor neuron disease. And pretty much all those studies find that there's an increased risk in these populations. In this particular New Zealand paper, I think the risk was quantified at not slightly higher, but not significantly higher. I think it was about 15-20% higher, if memory serves me. Apologies if I've misquoted the number. In the Scottish footballers, it was about 20 to 30% higher, and in the rugby players, it was substantially higher. But interestingly, they didn't actually have a motor neuron case in the rugby players, so they had to hypothetically assume we had one, and then the risk would have been 15 times higher because the samples are so small and the condition's so rare. It's really difficult to study motor neuron disease.
Yeah, because I'd read in an article somewhere that it was also higher cases in, for example, agriculture industry, possibly because of pesticides. And there was a list of, and nobody really knows. There was a list of these potential causes.
Yeah, I remember when
heavy metals, things like that.
Exactly. Like South Africa's had a few. The most famous player with motor neuron disease was Joost van der Westhuizen. But there were a couple other players at the time. Ruben Kruger was one. Tinus Linney, I think, was another one. And Andre Venter. And at the time, the journalists in South Africa were digging around, and they were saying, "Oh, it's the fertilizer used on the grass." And I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
Because obviously we've had Doddy Weir, Rob Burrow, other players in rugby. So of course you see the headlines and you see the big names, and of course you put 2 and 2 together and perhaps make 5. But there's still the possibility.
Yeah, so I'd say the association is there now, the studies, but whether it's causing them or not is a different question. One thing that's interesting in the New Zealand study is that they found that when bundled together, the neurodegenerative diseases, the risk appears to be higher in backline players than in forwards, which is interesting because the argument has always been that if it's repeated contact, who's having more of those? And our data supports this. It's the forwards. So you'd think that the player who's exposed to the ruck and the maul and the scrum and the tackle and who makes more tackles and more carries, i.e. forwards, would have a higher risk. The New Zealand study is suggesting it's the other way around, which is pretty interesting. That's the first time I'd seen that. So yeah, it's I don't think it's a conclusive link. But regardless, when there's a story like that with Moody and the guys, you listed a bunch of names there and the South Africans, it's just a terrible disease. And in a way, it's like a reminder, that we have to keep pushing. You can't just say, let the boys play. Because if it's causing this, and you've got 2 or 3 levers that you can use, and we'll get onto one of those maybe in a moment, but if you can get a 10% lower through one intervention, tackle height, tackle technique can improve, another 10% benefit. Managing load, another 10-15% benefit. We'll end the show on another one. We'll come back to that later and finally. But the point is, if you can do those things, then these tragic cases, are the reason you have to do them.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned player load there, and it leads us nicely on to rugby again. The World Rugby Executive Board have agreed new player load guidelines. And this is our last rugby story for today, I promise. This really should apply to all sports, or at least contact sports, because World Rugby have said the new guidelines have stated that they should play no more than 30 games in a single season or 6 consecutive match weeks. They should have a dedicated 5-week off-season break, be entitled to minimum rest periods should they be selected for international fixtures of at least 1 week, across a year have 12 weeks of non-contact time, and the communications thoroughly between club and country. This is quite big news for rugby.
Yeah, it is, and it was picked up by the media surprisingly because I think there are some bullet points that you've just read out there that I thought would be more attractive to media discussions than the ones that they have picked up on. But anyway, it's
which ones have they picked up on, the media?
The 30-game limit was the main one, and I thought the 12 weeks non-contact would be more interesting to them. But I suppose that's because that was the one that when we developed these guidelines was the big argument or sticking point. Not sticking point, but the biggest debate was around that point.
Oh, so you've been involved, you said we.
Yeah, I was on the panel that eventually produced these guidelines. It was a long process actually, because a couple of years ago already, and this is the context that sometimes also didn't appear in the media, is that many of the competitions and unions already have local guidelines in place like this. So for instance, in England, the PRL RFU have already got a commitment to some of the things that you've just read out. They have had that for some time. Similarly, in France, they're slightly different, but they are there. Super Rugby is the same. So the players are covered in their local territories in which they play. But the drive to get this as a global guideline was initiated because there are many players who fall through the cracks. You know, they play in England or France, but they represent Argentina or Fiji or South Africa. And so they're not always necessarily covered by the guidelines. So this is an attempt to standardize around the global game and then get all the unions and the player agencies so that all the players in the world have got similar concepts around load management. So
the one that,
so I was just going to say, so the process was that a group of people were put together, and they included the competitions, I think for the first time, because this is really important. The biggest tension around this issue is who owns the player. The player's salary primarily, even when you're playing for international teams 12, 15 times a year, like you at Toja or DuPont and so on, their main source of salary is the club side. So the club owns the player, and the competitions in which the clubs participate have got, for obvious reasons, significant say in those players must appear in those competitions, right? It's logical that they wouldn't want their superstars to be on the sidelines for 2/3 of the club competitions because they're too busy playing international games. So there is a club versus country tension that exists and has to be sorted out. Who has to cover the load reductions, as it were. So that was really important that they were involved in this process. And then the others were coaches, medical folk, scientific folk, to see whether there was data that we could gather to support these decisions, etc.
Mm-hmm. The one that surprised me a little was that you can't play more than 6 consecutive match weeks.
Yeah, which doesn't happen often. So it's a worst case scenario, which is quite rare. So is 30 games a year, by the way. You want to take a stab at what proportion of players in France, England, and URC, this is the competition South Africa, Ireland, son, actually exceed 30 matches a year?
Yeah, you've told me this before, and it's surprisingly low. I just can't remember the figure.
It's 4 to 5%. So only every 25th player exceeds 30 matches a year. The median, which is, think of it kind of like the average, it's the midpoint. So let's think about the typical player, only plays between 14 and 16 matches a year.
So these aren't really as surprising or as you would think. Then these or not as they're not going to be as difficult to implement as you would think.
No, and that's why when the media picked up on 30 games a year, the media finds straight away Gregory Aldrit of France, Mario Toge, Sia Khaleesi maybe, players who play a lot. And they say, what's going to happen with those players? But they're finding the 1 in 25 player. And the reason the 30 games a season was not all that contentious is because it really doesn't apply to many players. You could almost make a case to say, 20 games a year, then you catch 35% of players, for instance. But obviously it becomes a squad management issue because you've got to have a bigger squad if you're going to cycle players, and there's financial implications. So it's not as easy as some outsiders think here to just say play less, because the financial model around the game would also collapse.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
As I say, though, I think the interesting one, and the 12 weeks of non-contact is not actually part of the guideline. It's a recommendation by the International Rugby Players Association.
I must admit, I thought that was already in place anyway. I thought that you were only allowed to have a certain number of contact training sessions. So the
NFL does that. They've got a limit on contact training in season, and they actually send people to film sessions to ensure compliance. Rugby is really interesting because, and this is another point that wasn't picked up. If you read the statement on these guidelines, which is available online, I'll see if I can find the link for you as well in the show notes. It emphasizes that the gold standard, as it were, is individual player management. Because I'll give you a scenario, is if you are a typical player in England and you only play 14 matches a year, compared to Mario Toge or Etzebeth, Aldrich, whoever it is, who plays the 30 matches a year, pretty clearly your match demand is so much lower that your 12 weeks of non-contact time isn't necessary.
No.
It's like, why would you manage a player who plays 8 matches a year, 14 matches a year, and 30 matches a year the same way? It makes no sense. So clearly the best strategy is going to be individual management, but it's resource heavy and it's intensive, and it relies a little bit on good faith of the people involved and so on. So there has to be a standard that sort of sits above it, but within that, individual management is still the best way to go about this.
I wish I'd trained harder now, because it sounds like an easy life now, only playing 14 matches a year.
I don't know about
It's
that.
only just over one a month.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's interesting to look at why that is, and we looked at the data on this. We said, how often do players play 6 consecutive matches, or 20 matches, 24 matches, 28 matches, 32 matches, and a lot of the time they play as few matches as they do because of injuries. You pick up an injury, you lose 6 weeks of your season, and then another injury later in the year costs you 3 weeks. That's 9 weeks out of your 36 that are gone straight away.
But I think the public perception, my perception, is that the players are on this constant grinding treadmill where they're playing week in, week out, week in, week out until they're exhausted.
Exactly.
Because that's what we see and that's what we hear.
Yeah.
But it's not the case.
And the data says otherwise. The other public perception around this that's interesting is the public thinks that players are smashing each other on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in training. They think the players are doing too much contact. But we've got the mouthguard data now, and it's crazy. Like, for every impact you have in training, you have 6 in a match. Training makes
non-contact,
Sorry, go on.
When you say non-contact training, is that full? Do you mean full non-contact? Do you mean, are they allowed to use like tackle bags?
No, that's meant to imply no contact at all.
Oh, right, okay.
So not even what we call controlled contact or semi-contact would be how. And there's a separate contact load guideline. But it's an interesting one because, like, literally, no exaggeration, head impacts, head acceleration events in training are outnumbered 6 to 8 to 1. So, in other words, only 12% of a player's head load comes in training. The rest of it is in matches. And everyone's got this perception that they're just hitting each other and smashing each other in training. And I actually think there's a case to be made for you need contact training in order to develop technical proficiency, because otherwise the only contact you get in a match, then what's going to happen?
Exactly. It's no wonder we see so much poor scrummaging. If you're not allowed to scrummage, scrummaging is contact. But it's true. Scrummaging is highly technical, and if you don't get the practice, then it's no wonder that you're going to be struggling if you haven't scrummaged for a while, and next time you're up against an international front row.
And since we started this whole drive to try and reduce head impacts in the game, the one thing that's emerged whenever you talk to the defense coaches, John Dobson on this podcast, is they don't do tackle training in training because they know that it's too risky, but also because their main focus is on teaching players defensive systems and tactics, not execution. And so when you ask the top defense coaches of the top international teams in the world, they will tell you that players can't tackle. It's crazy. Like, they will say the players aren't technically competent to tackle. And because we don't teach them how to tackle, because we've got too many other things we have to teach them. So I think there's a risk of underdoing contact in training in order to try and reduce it, and then you just actually kick the consequence across to the match. But
interesting.
Anyway, yeah.
Okay, that's enough for rugby. That's enough Discourse Digest. Let's move on to our centre stage. And today, I think this could be a good one. It came up on Discourse, bro science. So it came up in context of David, who did a Zwift ride and did basically an experiment on himself on a very long Zwift ride, and headlined the post "Bro Science," which it wasn't really, because it was just him doing an experiment on himself. But it ignited Lewin to ask about bro science, and then could we have a section about it? And I know you got a bit excited about this. So it is something has triggered you to do with the term bro science. And I wasn't even sure. Well, we hear it bandied around, the term bro science. So I think we need to start off with defining it.
Yeah.
So where would you start there?
Yeah, like, I think bro science has become the term given to faddish, overhyped hacks in health and well-being. I think hack is the key term. Like, to me, it originates in, like, the Silicon Valley. Waking up, I'm having 5 sleeps of 1 hour a night at a time. Five shifts of 1 hour sleep. I'm the sort of Timothy Ferriss 4-hour work week type stuff applied to fitness and training and performance. In fact, he wrote a book called The 4-Hour Body, which was exactly this stuff. And it was all these like hacks for how you could accelerate your gains and get more out of less. And I think it sort of appealed to that culture, that mindset or that mentality of like, we're going to just like absolutely wring dry every possible benefit we can get. And this is how you too can benefit from it. Never go to gym in your life again. Just do these 5 simple things, that sort of stuff. That's my interpretation of bro science.
For me, it's if I ever see anything that says shredded in the title, or if it's I did this exercise or whatever it was for once a day for 100 days or 100 times a day for 10 days.
Yeah,
these are the results.
And to be clear, bro science is not just males.
Oh yeah.
Like if you go on Instagram now, like and you scroll through that, I don't know how that algorithm works, but like you'll see all these posts. Here's what I eat in a day to stay 116 pounds or something. You know what I mean? Like it's these, and then it's these inane videos of someone mixing up a smoothie powder and drinking a beetroot juice or something. So it applies to both sexes, and it applies to pretty much health, nutrition, exercise training. I should have played that clip in. You know that scene in There's Something About Mary where he picks up a hitchhiker and he says 6 steps to abs or something like that. 6 steps to getting a 6-pack. And he says, what if someone comes along with 5? It's that sort of thinking, that mentality, right? Like I'm going to undercut you and get it done even better, more acceleration, more results in less time, less energy. That's bro science.
That's pretty much exactly it, isn't it?
It's
everybody wants a shortcut. Nobody wants to put the hard work in.
Pretty much, yeah. It's selling shortcuts, hacks, basically. So the reason Lewin's post was interesting to me is because remember Malcolm Gladwell said this. He said like people are experience rich, theory poor. Bro science capitalizes on that. Because my experience is that if I drink mud 6 times a day, I lost weight. Therefore, you must do it too. Experience, don't worry about theory, just listen to my experience. And if you look the part, then people are inclined to believe you. So that's the sort of underpinning philosophy that I think gives this thing so much momentum. So the reason Lewin's post was interesting to me, to get back to this, is because in trying to communicate the science, you can't discount how people's experiences persuade other people.
No. Anecdotal data is sort of quite important, and it's quite important on discourse. And that got me thinking is cramps, because the podcast you did on cramps,
it was massive.
And the amount of anecdotal stories about how people have dealt with cramps.
Yeah.
But everybody had a different story to tell. Everybody had a different way of dealing with it. That's not bro science, though. It's just anecdotal evidence, N=1, isn't it?
Correct. And I'm really interested. I think my approach is always to say, how can we extract the maximum possible value of those anecdotes? I thought that cramp thread, for instance, was really interesting. David's thread on his 6-hour indoor zone 2 ride it drove really interesting conversations. And so, in a sense, this podcast exists just like Gladwell described himself, to add theory to experiences. So I see anecdotes like that as opportunities to try and say, well, why did that work for you? And how can other people learn? What lessons out of your experience should everyone borrow from, and which ones can they discard? And I think that's the line for me that separates positive anecdote from, let's call it bro science, is the extent to which you think your experience must be relevant to everyone is the first flag. If I did this and it worked, it will work for you. That's the first warning sign, I think.
Do you remember the Atkins diet?
Oh yeah, that was massive for a long time.
That was dietary bro science then, because you had so many zealots saying this works for me and it's worked so well, they couldn't help but tell you all about it, and you must do it.
Yeah, exactly. So was barefoot running. Remember how evangelical they got?
So do you think that's a facet of bro science? It's one of the telltale signs, one of the red flags.
Yeah, for me, the first red flag is, this is the way. I did it, thus it will be the way for you. It's almost like an evangelical approach. I am saved. Follow me.
How about another red flag, as we're on to flags?
Yeah.
Is if they're selling you anything.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Not always, though. Not always. But you're right. Like, I mean, that's going to be. You've always got to look behind the initial pitch and see when the product arrives.
Mm.
Yeah.
How about if you're told that you must do this or you have to do this? For example, creatine. Um, with creatine, there's a loading phase and a deloading phase, and it turns into this sort of mystic sort of mumbo jumbo. When all you've really got to do is just take a scoopful of creatine every day.
Correct.
The
And
rest of it is just to make it sound more involved than it is,
yeah.
because otherwise it's just a 5-second video.
And allied to that, and I think we've brought this up in the past actually, is you'll see people are very instructive, as in you must, have to, and very specific. Take this at this time in this dose and do it this way and this. Whenever anyone commits to too much specific information and instruction, it's a warning flag that I think you should dismiss.
Mm-hmm.
Because nothing in physiology, if you've learned one thing from listening to our ramblings, nothing in physiology is like, oh yeah, it's obvious you have to do it this way. There's always complexity and redundancy and safeguards and exceptions to the rule. And that's why I say it depends so much, because it's never simple. So when people oversimplify, turn it into a very specific instruction, you've got to be saying, hang on a moment, I'm not sure I'm buying this.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
well,
your next
mathematics says
flag.
that on Discourse. He says trainer specifics don't make a huge difference. It's pretty simple to get 95 to 99% of your genetic limit. Not easy, but simple. Do the fundamentals and do them right. Eat properly. Train with as much volume as your body can handle, with as much intensity as your body can handle. Make your target train specific, and that's it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make for a great video, does it?
No,
It
you
doesn't
can't.
make for a great influencer.
Yeah, imagine trying to sell that book.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty short book, but it makes sense. Donald says the same though. He says bro science shouldn't be anti-science though. But a reflection, there are some areas where proper science hasn't yet caught up with what is or appears to be working in the real world, and the experience of life can guide you even without solid scientific backing. At one point, pickle juice for cramps could have been called bro science. It works, so let's keep doing it. And an explanation as to why can come later.
Yeah,
That's
but
a good
I would pull Donald's right, but I also want to pull him up a little bit. Is that pickle juice doesn't work for everyone. So clearly it's not like the solution. If someone ever says, if you cramp, pickle juice will solve it, it's bro science. But if someone says, I tried pickle juice and it really worked for me and I'm interested in why, now we can explore all that stuff that we did about that reflex and how it controls and what it teaches us about cramps. Now it became a really useful anecdote. So Donald's right, like we shouldn't just dismiss, and this is what I was saying earlier, no, and you were too, is that these anecdotes are really, really important, but the extent to which we try and apply them to solve all problems related to their area is the issue.
point. Do you remember it was a while ago you came up, we were talking about opportunity costs, I think it was.
Yeah.
And if whether you're going to do something or not is based on, you have a look at the cost of it.
Which is not just financial.
Not just financial, the cost in time or whatever. And you sort of cross-reference that, don't you, with the potential benefits or the potential pitfalls or whatever, and then you come out with whether or not it's worth doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So you just need to do that against each of the things, because we were talking about on Caught My Eye, the number of articles that I've linked to, which I've got some of them. It was like, was it fiber maxing? Why is everybody wearing weighted vests? The Q36.5. Do you remember the silver threaded garments that stopped something or other? So many different things every week, crawling around like an animal. If you try to employ all these things, you'd be broke and have no time whatsoever. You'd spend your entire life just trying to fill your day with all these things. What was this one? Kettlebell challenges, 100 kettlebell swings a day.
Yeah,
I'm sure it does you some good, but it's bang for your buck, isn't it?
Yeah, and some of them have risks as well. So in your assessment of costs versus benefits, and that's a marketing framework. It's customer perceived value is the difference between what the customer sees as getting out of a product versus what they have to spend on the product. You know, it's the same model for making decisions around health and exercise. And one of the problems, like with barefoot running again, to come back to that, the diet is if I eat this, I can't eat that. And did I need to eat that? Because now I've actually cost myself. There's not just negative. Whereas some of these things are benign, you know, like some of them you can do and they cost very little. There's no downside, there's no risk to them, and you can probably go about them. But it's very difficult to quantify what some of those negative things are, but yeah, the opportunity cost is a pretty obvious one. Is if I wasn't doing X, I'd be doing Y. Should I be doing Y rather? You know, that's the best way to assess a training approach. If I do double threshold sessions in a day, okay, but then what am I not going to do? Because I can't do 3 things a day. So which one am I sacrificing? So yeah, there's a few ways that you can make decisions around those things.
I've noticed that the weightlifting sphere is heavily influenced by bro science.
Yeah,
I think there must be something about it.
It's visual.
That makes it particularly susceptible.
I think it's visual.
How do you mean visual?
Like you see results.
Right. You see these gains, see your abs, see your muscles.
Stuart Phillips, who's been a guest on this podcast, he's made it a mission. I'm not sure what the catalyst was for it. I should ask him one day to like take on the bro science guys in that sphere, in that space. And so he's on all the time on Instagram and socials talking about how much protein do you really need? Do you need creatine? Should you lift heavy? Should you lift to fatigue? All those kinds of questions. Can you do endurance training and resistance training? And so he's constantly addressing and taking on those kinds of things. But they exist there. And I don't know, maybe it's just because it's so visual. You know, here's a guy who says, look at me. This is what I did. Do what I did, and you too will look like this. So I don't know, but it is an area ripe for that.
Endurance-wise, is Zone 2 bro science?
Again, I think it depends on...
If you must do Zone 2 to within 95% of your...
Yeah, and if you're being
threshold.
sold, this is the way to do it, and you've been told you need to do high-intensity training, but I'm here to tell you now, folks, that is wrong. And everything you'd thought you knew is disproven by the fact that I've succeeded doing this. And sometimes they'll have data and science and so on it, and they'll say, well, this paper, even these 3 papers, 5 papers, 25 papers proves blah, blah, blah. But guarantee you there's going to be 25 papers on the other side. That's why that podcast we did with Brendan Gerd was so controversial. And again, I think we discussed a lot, like maybe the pitch on that was a little bit inaccurate or imprecise from our side. But it was so controversial because there are so many ways to develop and to challenge endurance adaptations. And what he was saying is that the way that it's sold as the sort of holy grail of training, if you wish, is not necessarily the only way of training. So then it did become, I think, bro science.
Yeah, like the Norwegian method. All these things, you could just basically line them up, couldn't you? And there's nothing wrong with any of them. I think somebody makes the point again on Discourse that if it gets you out of bed in the morning and you enjoy doing the Norwegian method, then go ahead and do it. It's not, it's not wrong.
Yeah, and then in 3 months' time, when you get bored of that and you decide to switch over to something else, do that too. Doesn't matter. Just do something. So we've given you some warning flags. I'll tell you the other one is like excessive confidence. You know, like I will not countenance any dispute here. I know I'm right, and you will not tell me I can possibly be incorrect on this. So that's another warning sign. And the other 2 are lack of awareness about bias. That's one of the key attributes of science, right? Is like it's aware of its potential for bias. I understand that just because you started with creatine doesn't mean the creatine's the thing making you better, because at the same time as the creatine, you changed 5 things. Were you aware of those 5 things? You know, that's where people like the Liver King. Remember that guy who spoke about only eating raw meats? Meanwhile, he was on about 17 different anabolic steroids.
Yeah.
So that's an example, a very stupid, obvious.
Made him very rich, though.
Yeah, exactly. People are susceptible to those kinds of things, and they don't understand biases either, and like what they're not seeing. And then the final one is like a complete inability to recognize limitations. We've spoken in the past, when you read a scientific paper, for me, the most important part of that paper is in the discussion where they discuss the limitations. Because if they don't see their own limitations, I'm not sure I trust them to see their data.
You caught me out on one of those papers the other day, didn't you?
I don't know if it caught you out. I know which one you're talking about. You're talking about the one where the weekend warriors compared to the regular exercise.
That was the one. Yeah. It was a good paper, that was.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I completely glossed over the part of the weakness of the actual.
yeah, but again, like I would always say, like, does this person recognize limitations? And the bro scientists never do.
Yeah.
So it's a
And
hallmark.
quite often you find that they'll cling to a scientific paper, which might not be scientifically that valid, the results or whatever.
Yeah.
But it'll be quoted over and over and over again, and we do sometimes see the same papers over and over and over again as proof that this particular phenomenon exists.
Yeah, I mean, that's their attempt to bring theory to experience. They say, this was my experience, and here's a paper to support me. So, cool. Good. I'm glad you found a paper. Here's another 10 that disrefute you. What do you make of those? Oh, that's not good.
So yeah, post some more of these bro sciences on Discourse. We'll have to have a crack at some specifics.
Yeah, and you know what I think is interesting is to encourage people to share those anecdotes. And this is the value, I think, of Discourse, is that there are very thoughtful, systematic, sincere folk who've got great experience, and they bring an awareness of bias and limitation, and they're sharing those things. But when you do that, I would just always think about, where are the biases? What am I potentially missing? Do I understand the constraints, the limitations? And here's my story.
Well, I've noticed that people, if they do advise like that, they often say it worked for me, but
Yeah, you got to
and they'll
couch
often
it.
put n=1
Exactly.
and say, well, people are very aware of it.
Exactly, and I mean, that's what we try and do, But as you said, we're not selling millions of books and Instagram.
Speaking of which, I want your advice.
Yeah.
Because on Sunday, and I don't want bro advice. On Sunday, I ran the Cardiff half marathon, and I rode my bike to Cardiff, did the Cardiff half marathon, and rode home. So the next day, I was feeling quite fatigued, and I didn't need my watch, my body battery reading, or whatever it was, to tell me that I was knackered. I was knackered in work all day. So I'd known that I'd stressed my body. I could really feel it. And then that Monday night, I was looking at what I sort of had written down what I was going to do that day, and it was bench pressing. And I was thinking, well, I don't think I've really stressed in my legs. Like, I cycled and I ran. So is it okay if I bench press, even though I'm feeling very tired and fatigued? So my question to you was, is there a cost to me overall? Would I have been okay to just go and do that and just like not wimped out? Or is it worth just letting your body recover completely and not stressing another part of it?
Yeah, it depends.
Are you going to say that?
90% of the time, I reckon, you can get away with a light stress. I'm using stress instead of exercise session because, like, I want to try and shift our thinking to it as a stressor, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think 90% of the time, people who are fatigued in one stress domain can do another type and it would be fine. Their body would be more than capable of dealing with that new stress, that additional stress, and they'd recover just fine. But it sounds to me like what you did, the cycle, the half marathon, you were so fatigued that probably in this 1 in 10 instance, you probably would have been better off to just say, let's write off the day after the Monday and I'll resume the normal routine on Tuesday. But the reason I think 9 out of 10 times it's fine is because as long as you manage that stress as a new stress that's low enough, you're not compounding the existing stress that you're still trying to recover from. But the thing is that bench press session does not come at zero cost. No. It comes at a neurological, hormonal, admittedly small, but non-zero metabolic cost. And so the fact that you're doing it, the body's still saying, okay, this is now another stress on top of the stress that we're already trying to deal with. And I think if you accumulate too much of that constantly without at some point giving the body entire focus on recovery, you probably do compromise yourself a little bit.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So it's not like the body stops recovering when you then take on that new load.
No, but it's
it can't maximize its recovery.
Yeah, the body's got a budget. Let's call it a hormonal, metabolic, physiological resource budget. And it is spending that on recovery. And when you then go and do another exercise session, you take from that budget. Now, the thing is, as I say, 9 out of 10 times, you can take a small enough amount from a different enough budget that your body can reallocate some of those resources, and it can deal just fine with the leg fatigue, the metabolic fatigue, etc. And you can do the upper body strength session and you'll be fine. It's a small muscle group. It's probably not going to incur significant load. No problem by Tuesday, Wednesday. But when the cost is that high from the hard session you've done on the Sunday, then you probably want to say, let's allocate all the resources to recovery. It's not that different from, I'm feeling a little bit like in the early stages of getting a head cold. Should I exercise or not? 9 out of 10 times, you probably get away with it. But you might be better off actually just saying, let me allow my body to allocate all the necessary resources to dealing with what might be an infection, and I can train again when I've got resources to spare on training, if that makes sense.
With the elite athletes, is that obviously it's a real skill to know when you've got to back off then?
Yeah, exactly. And how much you can get away with in terms of the additional load in a non-fatigued area. Like in your case, it's leg fatigue, but can I get away with... So for an elite triathlete, it might be that I've done a really big week of running, but I can still load in the pool and do a lot of swimming technical work. And that way I'm still maximizing training time without the injury risk of additional load stress from more running and even potentially more cycling and high volume swimming.
Any idea if pro athletes, they trust in their smart watches, smart devices to tell them when they're fatigued, or do they do it pretty much by feel?
Probably too many trust the watch, but I
Do you
reckon...
Yeah, and I'm only asking like generally. I know you don't.
Or even if it's 20% who blindly trust the watch, it's too many. But I don't know, like they would have coaches and they would be constantly in communication. How do we feel today? Monitor it with the tech, listen to their body, and have a third party, well, in this case, second pair of eyes on them to see, am I... And you know, like you'll know this, like you'll go out for an easy ride or run and you know what it's meant to feel like, and within the first 10 minutes you know, actually I'm better off turning around and going home today. So that's where you discover it. Your scenario is trickier because you're not actually doing something that's going to tell you, because it's bench press exercises.
Yeah, it's trickier because I'm not as fit as them.
That's also true.
Because obviously the fitter you are, the more you can do, so the less it...
Well, that's easier for us because they're so fit that they can tolerate that load and train themselves
until they snap,
until they break. Whereas we're weak and give up easier.
Okie doke. Right. Quick one on listener lens. Very quick one. Because Gianni asked about how much of your fueling comes from the fuel from the night before and how much is added at breakfast, because he doesn't like to have breakfast early in the mornings. So he says, how much does the body rely on breakfast versus the previous evening's meal for morning exercise? For high intensity sessions, does the body have enough time to process and then use breakfast within 1 to 2 hours, or does it primarily use energy stored from the previous evening's meal? And I know we've touched on this in podcasts before, but what would be your opinion or advice on this one?
Yeah, so when we had Jamie Whitfield on, we spoke to him about the breakfast before a session in the morning. And it was interesting because I didn't know this until I asked him this question, and he answered it. Is it an overnight fast? In other words, I eat dinner on Thursday night, and for, let's call it 12, 13 hours, no more, and then I go and exercise the morning after. I'm not completely depleted. In fact, I'm not even actually close. I think his estimate was like between 20 and 50% depleted. So your liver glycogen is still there in the next morning to power and provide some fuel for exercise. Now remember, what the liver is doing is it's ensuring that the blood glucose level stays high enough, which is really important because the brain needs sugar, because that's where the brain gets its energy from, as we're about to discover. The brain doesn't store glycogen like muscles and liver do. So the liver has a really important function, and if you run out of sugar from the liver, then you are not going to have a good session. But the thing is, you've probably got enough there to handle an hour easy in the morning, even after an overnight fast without breakfast. If your session's longer than that, then you probably need to start thinking about taking energy in on the journey. But you probably then still don't need breakfast. The only thing I've found, and at the risk of doing it as a bro science answer, my experience is that if I get hungry as a physical sensation, then that's not good. So that's what breakfast is for. Breakfast is just to put something solid into your stomach so that you don't feel hungry. But from a blood glucose regulation and an energy provision point of view, as long as you're taking energy in once you start exercising, I think you can do that more than adequately.
Perfect.
The analogy is, if you're driving a long journey and you're going to get into your car, you don't have to start with a full tank of gas, as long as you have a plan to stop regularly and top up what was there at the start. You've got enough to get to the first station, then the second station, then the third station. So your in exercise, on bike or on the run nutrition is more important for those long rides or runs than preloading with either breakfast or even the night before, actually.
Yeah, it surprises me that the overnight fast, it doesn't, was it 20 to 50%?
I think that's what Jamie gave us as a figure, yeah.
Looking here, so there we go. That was just a little quick one, just wanted to touch on fueling. And finally, my turn.
Yep.
So my and finally this week is about concussion. We're going back to concussion. Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. He suffered a number of concussions, as you might know, in his career. But he's discovered basically how to prevent concussions. He hit his head hard on Monday night, but he didn't suffer a concussion. He took a blow to the head while he was sliding. After the game, he said he mentioned his nutritional changes aimed at limiting concussions. He said, just carbing up more for the games and getting more fluids in, I think it definitely helps with that aspect of the brain. Throughout the years, that was one of the bigger things we hadn't addressed. I was making sure that I got a good amount of carbs in my body, so as I drank water or drank the right stuff or whatever it was, it'd stay in. The doctors were talking about the liquid that your brain sits in and all of that. So that was just the biggest aspect. I guess for me, what I've come to know or understand from doctors is that your brain kind of sits in fluids. And if I'm eating eggs, bacon, and sausage, and there's not much carbs, like if there's no bread or whatnot, you drink water, it'll just flush out of you, so you can't stay hydrated that way. But the carbs kind of help soak that in and stay there. So his theory is by eating lots of carbs, it keeps the water surrounding his brain there, and his brain doesn't get concussed. That's reading between the lines.
Yeah.
What do you make of that, Doc?
Well,
Prof?
Bro. I was interested in this one because these things don't come out of nowhere. So somewhere in the literature, there will be some theory about carbohydrate loading and carbohydrates after concussion to accelerate recovery and so forth. And I managed to actually find one or two things on this. One is a survey that was done in dietary experts and nutrition consultants in Ireland, where they spoke about how their strategy for the concussed players, so this is someone who's already suffered a concussion, is to give them like 500 grams of carbohydrates a day, which isn't actually even that much. That's probably 6 to 8 grams per kilogram per day. And they reckon it accelerated recovery. There are some studies in mice where they they cause concussions. They concuss these mice, and then they've also found that if they feed them extremely high amounts of carbohydrates, their recovery time is... I don't know how you know when a mouse has recovered from a concussion. Don't ask me that.
How do you mean you've concussed a mouse?
I think
with a tiny hammer. Oh, this is awful.
Listen, I think they sacrifice those mice and take their brains and examine them under a microscope or something, or an MRI. But anyway, there's some theory there that after a concussion, the metabolic demand from the brain goes up. And as we've just noted in our answer to Gianni's question, the brain needs carbohydrates. It needs glucose from the blood. So there's this theory that once you've been concussed, if you don't have sufficient carbohydrates, then your brain can't meet its new elevated metabolic demand. And I have a feeling that's probably how this message has gotten across to Tua Tagovailoa. I reckon it's something to do with that. Because, frankly, there is no evidence at all that carbohydrates are protective against a concussion. Even theoretically, it doesn't work because, as we've noted, the brain doesn't store carbs. So this idea of fluids being stored with carbs, that's true of the muscle. In fact, one of the theories for why carbohydrate loading and the day after a rest day in the Tour de France are sometimes difficult for cyclists is because of this idea that when they have lots of carbs, they also absorb or store more water with glycogen. And that's true. You do store fluid with glycogen. But the brain doesn't do that, so there's not even a basis for that to be the case. And now the brain is surrounded by this thing called cerebrospinal fluid. So yes, there's fluid there, but there's no way that like more carbohydrates in my liver and glycogen in my muscle are going to impact the volume of cerebrospinal fluid around my brain. It's just not possible. So there's no basis for this to be true at all.
But this is how stories get twisted and theories.
Yeah, and the media, of
come
course, are
about.
reporting this, like, no, and I mean, one of them said this is, and it's unclear as to whether this works, and that's about as far as the media will go towards making a disclaimer. But no, there's no way that this is going to be protective. But I think it's a kind of broken telephone thing where post-concussion energy deprivation might make your situation worse. And so therefore the theory is before concussion, have more carbs, energy, and you'll be better. But it doesn't work like that. So no, I'm afraid that's probably not true. And Tagovailoa's better approach is just not to get hit on the head.
Yeah, it's the article finishes. The very last line says, "On Monday night, those blows to the head did not result in a fresh concussion." So it's proven.
Proof, right? That's what they want to sell. So it's not. So now it's interesting. Like coming back to what we were saying, opportunity cost. If someone sees that and says, "All right, I'm going to take in more carbohydrates now because it's going to be protective against concussion," there's probably no real downside to that except the money in their teeth.
You might get that Superman.
Yes, actually, you're right. You might get that. You might get, if you really, really believed that all those energy drinks that you pour down your neck before kickoff have made you immune to concussion. Maybe you get that. But anyway, don't do that at home, kids. It's not going to work.
And luckily, I'm not an NFL quarterback either, so there we go.
Yeah, the better way is to just not get hits on the head. I noticed in that article, actually, they spoke about after his previous concussions, he went for jiu-jitsu training so that he could improve his ability to fall. That's probably true.
Yeah.
The problem is, after he went to jiu-jitsu training, he got hit again and he got a concussion. So now they say, oh, the jiu-jitsu didn't work. Well, no.
Well, the jiu-jitsu didn't work because he got concussed the last time. I think it was against the Bills because he was sliding and somebody nearly took his head off.
Yeah, so
what's no jiu-jitsu training in the world. It was because, as you've said before, when quarterbacks fall, they tend to fall backwards.
If they're in the process of throwing, they fall backwards and they've got no way to brace the fall, so they hit their head on the ground.
Apparently, it was meant to help with that jiu-jitsu training.
Even that, if I'm in the act of throwing a ball and my eyes are looking downfield for a receiver and that's where all my focus is, I mean, I'm not going to recall my jiu-jitsu lessons in the half a second it takes to meet the earth, So.
Well, you don't recall them, do you? It's muscle memory.
Well, that's what I mean, like recall, physiological recall.
But I wonder if, because perhaps the team were desperate to keep him playing.
Yeah.
He was worth a lot of money. So just tell him that he needs to eat carbs and do jiu-jitsu training. He'll be fine, bro.
Exactly.
Okay.
Anyway.
We're stretching it.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks very much, Gareth, as always. Thanks for listening, folks. As mentioned at the start, Discourse is where the conversation continues, and you know what to do. There's a link in the show notes. Click there. And if you enjoy what we do, feel free to pledge some support. We will be back next week with another spotlight. Keep the topics coming. We'll talk about them in the next show. Until then, goodbye.